Today we're going to talk about cold connections. The essential question is, what is so important about understanding the different kinds of cold connections? You can also use the Cornell notes that are linked in the bottom of this slide. The learning targets are, I understand the tools, techniques, and order of the cold connection process in order to create a piece that is well crafted and shiny. I understand the safety protocols to protect my body and others during the cold connection process, and I understand how to create a cold connection piece that follows the requirements. A cold connection is a permanent way to attach two things without heat. There are several types of cold connections that can be used in jewelry or other sculpture. Here you can see the different types of cold connections. They are rivets, bolts, nuts and screws, glue and epoxy, slot and tab, and wire wrapping. There are different types of rivets that you can create, some with plexiglass and wood, metal or mesh, spaced rivets, and tube rivets. The different tools for riveting are a ball peen hammer, a chasing hammer, steel block, an anvil, cutting pliers, and files. The requirements for this piece will be that you have to have 10 piercings, two other techniques that we've already learned, areas of contrast, and in that contrast you can use texture, color, line, shape, or something else that creates contrast. You need to have at least 4 rivets or 4 tabs, and the piece needs to be functional. When you are creating rivets, you have to create a hole for where the rivet is going to go in order to connect your piece of metal to whatever else you're connecting it to. You could connect two pieces of metal together, but you could also connect a piece of metal to wood or plexiglass or some other type of non-metallic surface. Here you can see a sizing chart for rivets. Basically what you're going to be using is something called a brad, which is a small nail. You need to make sure that you're using the gauge plate in order to figure out how large your brad is, and then you're going to need to use the correct drill bit size in order to create the appropriate sized hole for your rivet. They have to be very snug or the rivet will not work. Basically, you're going to design your piece. You need to make sure that there's 1 millimeter of space around the rivet. Then you're going to get the metal that you're going to use. You could use any type of metal. Here I'm actually showing nickel silver. The metal should be finished to a high shine before you create the actual physical rivets. The rivets are actually going to be the very last thing that you're going to put on the piece. Again, you are going to need to measure the brad or nail with a wire gauge. Then you're going to mark the space where the rivet is going to go. Again, you need to make sure that there's 1 millimeter of space around the whole rivet because you don't want it to break through the outside shape of your design. You're then going to tape the pieces together when you're drilling so that they don't move because the holes have to be in an exact place. Remember that you have to use the correct size drill bit and use a center punch before you drill. You should wrap the piece in cloth because again, you're going to polish the piece before you create the rivets. It's really important that you create one rivet at a time because if you drill all the holes before you create the rivets that hold it in place, you will have a problem later on. In addition to having 1 millimeter of space between your piece and the edge of the metal, you also want to have the brad or nail be about 1 millimeter above the metal when you are trying to create the rivet. That means that you should probably mark the brad, and here you can see the person using the yellow millimeter ruler so that they're marking the nail where they need to cut it. If the piece is too tall, the nail will bend and you'll stretch the hole, meaning that you'll never get the piece together the way that it should be. The next thing that you'll do once you've marked your piece is you're going to cut off the brad with the wire cutter at that 1 millimeter mark. Here it's actually showing it above the surface of the table, but you really want to have it on the table so that you don't lose the brad. Once you cut it, it'll be very hard to find the brad if you drop it on the floor. After you've cut the piece, you need to make sure to file the top flat because it will actually go to a point as you're cutting it. Then you're going to take a hammer and you're going to hammer in a cross-like pattern or in a concentric circle pattern in order to flatten out the rivets so that the pieces of metal stay together. You should have a piece of cloth between the hammer and your piece in order to protect it from getting dinged by the hammer as you hit the rivet down. This is actually showing you how you would hammer the head of the rivet. Again, you should be going in a circular fashion. Sometimes I even just say going in a cross-like or an X pattern also works. Basically what's going to happen is you're going to have your piece on a steel block as you cut the brad off, and then you're going to hammer between the steel block and the hammer, and there's nowhere for the metal to go, so it just expands instead of folding over. That being said, if the rivet is too tall, it will actually stretch the hole, and then you will never get it together the way that it should be. This is just showing you different types of rivets that you could make. If you put a piece of cardboard between the two pieces, sometimes you can even create rotating parts. You can also create different kinds of texture in the heads of the rivet if you would like. In addition to rivets, you can use nuts and bolts to create cold connections that will hold things together. You will see some pieces with bolts and nuts in them in the examples in a few moments. Another type of cold connection is slot and tab. The tools for slot and tab are using a saw frame or blade, files, and pliers. Then you want to make sure that you understand how slot and tab works. Basically, this picture on the right is showing you a paper doll. The clothing for paper dolls has tabs on it that when folded allow the clothing to be placed on the doll. You need to think of your slot and tab sort of like the clothing that would go on a paper doll. You're basically going to be creating tabs that hold another piece of metal or some other type of material together to your metal. There are many different ways that you can design this that you'll see again in the examples in a moment. Here are some examples of different slot and tabs that you can make. You can actually see that you can design several different ways to hold the pieces down together. They can fit within a hole. So over here on the right hand side, you can see the tabs that will go through the slots in another piece of material or metal. You can also design different types of tabs that are decorative. In addition to slot and tab, you can also use staples or bindings. Basically, it would be creating a piece of wire that would hold the pieces together. You can actually sew things together if you want. Wire wrapping is another type of cold connection, but it is so complicated that it is an entirely separate unit that we will be completing. You can also use different adhesives in order to cold connect pieces together. However, that is not as professional as the other methods that we just showed you. In addition, you could create things like hinges in order to create lockets or clasps. There are a couple of links on this slide that you can go to if you're interested in doing that, but you do need to be warned, those are very complicated to create, and it will take additional time than what is provided in class. You could also create buckles. So on the left-hand side, you can see different belt buckles that are used here, and there are even different types of hinges that you could create containers if you wanted to. You also need to think about creating catches if you are going to create some sort of locket or container. You should now be able to answer the essential question from the beginning of the presentation.